There is a set of tapestries in the Capodimonte Museum in Naples that depicts, across 7 enormous woven panels, a battle that lasted 4 hours on a February morning in 1525 and ended the Middle Ages. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. The Battle of Pavia on February 24th, 1525, ended the medieval world in the most literal sense available to military history. It was the first battle in European history in which portable firearms, arquebusiers, the shoulder-fired gunpowder weapons that were just becoming practical in the early 16th century, proved decisively superior to armored cavalry. The knight on horseback, the defining military figure of 1,000 years of European warfare, the embodiment of chivalric culture, the reason that the aristocracy of Europe spent its youth learning to ride and fight in armor. The knight was made obsolete at Pavia by a Spanish soldier with a gun, and the world that the knight had organized around himself began, on that morning, to come apart. The tapestries were designed by Bernard van Orly, the court painter of the Habsburg Netherlands, sometime between 1528 and 1531. Within a few years of the battle itself, when the men who had fought in it were still alive, when the shock of what had happened was still being processed by the courts and chanceries of Europe. They are extraordinary objects, each panel meters tall and wide, woven in wool and silk with a density of detail that rivals painting, showing the phases of the battle, the commanders, the geography of the Park of Pavia where the fighting took place, and, most remarkably, the moment that defined everything, the moment when the French king himself, Francis I, was unhorsed, surrounded, and taken prisoner. A king captured in battle. That had not happened in living memory. It would reshape the politics of Europe for a generation. To understand Pavia, we need to understand what was at stake in northern Italy in 1525, and why the richest and most powerful rulers in Europe were willing to spend blood and treasure on a campaign to control the Duchy of Milan. And to understand that, we need to go back further, to the world that produced both Francis I and Charles V, to the Italy that they were fighting over, and to the military revolution that was already underway before either of them was born. Italy, in the early 16th century, was the prize that every major European power wanted. It was the wealthiest region in Europe, the home of the banking houses and trading cities that had funded the Renaissance, the source of the luxury goods and financial services that the rest of Europe depended upon. Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, these were not simply cities. They were the financial centers of the Western world, the places where the instruments of modern commerce had been invented and refined over 2 centuries of extraordinary intellectual and commercial energy. Whoever controlled northern Italy controlled the flow of wealth between the Mediterranean and the rest of Europe. It was also, politically, a patchwork of city-states and duchies and papal territories that had been fighting each other for centuries, and were now, increasingly, being fought over by the larger powers of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The Italian states were individually too small and too divided to resist determined foreign intervention. They had been demonstrating this conclusively since 1494, when Charles VIII of France crossed the Alps with an army and demonstrated, to the shock of every Italian ruler, how vulnerable the peninsula was. His march from Turin to Naples encountered almost no serious resistance. The Italian city-states, for all their wealth and sophistication, could not stop a well-organized foreign army. The French had been intervening in Italy ever since, and the Duchy of Milan had become the central object of their ambitions. Milan was the gateway to the peninsula. Whoever held it controlled the Alpine passes and the road south. Louis XII had taken it, lost it, and taken it again. Francis I, young, magnificent, the very image of the Renaissance prince, 21 years old when he came to the throne in 1515, had led the French army to a spectacular victory at Marignano in September of that year, the battle that had made his reputation overnight and given France firm control of Milan for the first time in years. Marignano was Francis's defining moment, and he never quite escaped its shadow. He had fought in person, had led charges, had slept on the battlefield amid the dead, had received the accolade of knighthood from the Chevalier Bayard. The knight without fear and without reproach, the most celebrated warrior of the age, on the morning after the battle. He was, in the mythology he constructed around himself, and that his court enthusiastically propagated, the last great Night King, the embodiment of chivalric valor, the prince who led from the front, the man who won battles with his own sword. This identity was not entirely false. Francis was genuinely brave, genuinely skilled in the martial arts, genuinely beloved by his soldiers in a way that commanders who stayed safely behind the lines were not. But it was also a performance, a carefully maintained image that served political purposes, that legitimized his rule by connecting it to the tradition of sacred kingship and knightly virtue that the French monarchy had cultivated for centuries. And it was an image that would kill him at Pavia, or rather, that would cost him his freedom and his dignity, and nearly his throne. On the other side of the equation stood Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Lord of the Netherlands, ruler of the Habsburg lands in Central Europe, and heir to an empire that surrounded France on three sides and that represented, by 1520, the greatest concentration of power in Europe since Charlemagne. Charles was 20 years old when he became emperor in 1519, the year that he also consolidated his hold on Spain following the death of his grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon. He was not at first glance an imposing figure. Physically unprepossessing, with the protruding Habsburg jaw that made speaking and eating awkward, reserved to the point of coldness in social situations, entirely without the theatrical magnificence that Francis brought to every public occasion. But Charles was formidable in ways that Francis was not. He was patient where Francis was impulsive. He was systematic where Francis was brilliant but inconsistent. He understood, with a clarity that came from governing half a continent while still in his 20s, that power was not won in a single glorious afternoon, but maintained through the grinding work of administration, diplomacy, finance, and the long-term management of resources. He was also, crucially, backed by the wealth of Spain. The silver of the New World was beginning to flow into Castilian coffers in significant quantities, and Spanish revenues were already making Charles the best-funded monarch in Europe. Charles and Francis were almost exact contemporaries. Charles was 5 years younger, and they disliked each other with an intensity that went beyond strategic rivalry into something personal and permanent. They competed for the imperial title in 1519 in one of the most expensive elections in European history, each side bribing the German electors with spectacular sums. Charles won. Francis never forgave it. The Italian wars that dominated their reigns were, on one level, a geopolitical contest for European supremacy. On another level, they were the sustained expression of a personal antipathy between two proud men who each believed they were destined to be the dominant figure of their age. The campaign of 1524 and 1525 was the fourth major French intervention in Italy of the century, and it began promisingly for Francis. He crossed the Alps in October 1524 with a large and well-equipped army, drove the imperial forces back, and invested Pavia, the second city of the Duchy of Milan, a fortified place on the Ticino River held by a garrison of several thousand men under the command of Antonio de Leyva, one of the finest soldiers in imperial service. De Leyva was a remarkable man. He was suffering from gout so severe that he could not walk. He was carried around the city in a litter, but his mind was entirely clear, and his authority over the garrison was absolute. He managed the defense of Pavia with a skill and a resolution that kept the city alive through months of siege. repeatedly improvising solutions to the supply and manpower problems that the French blockade created, and never giving Francis the negotiated surrender that would have allowed the French king to move on. The French siege settled into the grinding routine of early modern blockade warfare. The army camped in the great hunting park that surrounded the city, the Mirabello Park, a vast enclosed space of several square kilometers, walled and wooded, the former pleasure grounds of the Visconti and Sforza dukes. It was, in its way, an extraordinarily pleasant place to besiege someone. The park offered clean water, wood for fires, game for the pot, and the kind of ordered natural landscape that Italian aristocratic culture had perfected over centuries. The French army made itself at home. Too much at home, some of Francis's more cautious advisers thought. The weeks turned to months. The city did not fall. The garrison, though hungry, continued to resist, and in January 1525, the Imperial Relief Army arrived on the other side of the Ticino. The army that came to relieve Pavia was a force of approximately 20,000 men, commanded by a council of generals whose collective talent was extraordinary. Charles de Lannoy, the Viceroy of Naples, held the nominal supreme command. Fernando d'Avalos, the Marquis of Pescara, commanded the Spanish infantry and was the most experienced battlefield commander on the imperial side. Georg von Frundsberg led the German Landsknechts, the mercenary pikemen, who, alongside the Spanish tercios, formed the backbone of imperial infantry power. These three men did not always agree on strategy, and the debates among them in the weeks before the battle were sometimes heated, but they shared a common understanding of the military situation and a common willingness to take calculated risks. The French army opposing them was larger. Contemporary estimates suggest Francis had somewhere between 28,000 and 35,000 men, including a substantial force of Swiss mercenaries and the gendarmerie, the heavy armored cavalry that was the most prestigious and most expensive element of any French royal army. He also had artillery, a train of guns that was, by the standards of the time, impressive in its weight and number. Artillery was the weapon that had transformed siege warfare in the previous half-century, enabling armies to reduce fortifications in days or weeks that previously would have held for months or years. In field battles, it was less decisive. The guns were heavy, difficult to move quickly once deployed, and most effective in static positions. But it was still a significant asset, and the French artillery at Pavia was well positioned to dominate the open ground between the two armies. The two forces faced each other across the Vernavola stream for several weeks in an increasingly tense standoff. The imperial commanders probed the French lines, looking for weaknesses. Francis was advised repeatedly by his most experienced generals, including the Constable of Bourbon, who had defected to the imperial side and knew French tactics from the inside, to be patient, to let the siege work, to avoid a pitched battle unless the conditions were strongly in his favor. He was also running short of money and supplies, which created pressure to force a decision before the army dissolved around him. On the night of February 23rd, the imperial commanders made their move. They had discovered or created a breach in the park wall large enough to move an army through, and in the darkness they began moving their forces inside the park, attempting to reach a position from which they could engage the French before dawn made their movements visible. The operation did not go entirely according to plan. The movement was noisier than expected, the darkness was not complete, and French sentries detected the intrusion. By the time the gray February dawn began to lighten the sky, both armies were deploying for battle inside the park, among the trees and hunting lodges and ornamental water features of what had been a pleasure ground and was now a killing field. Francis made a decision in the first light of that morning that every subsequent historian has called the decisive error of the battle and possibly of his reign. He ordered his artillery to cease firing. The reason he gave was that his own cavalry was moving through the line of fire. The gendarmerie, the heavy armored horsemen, the arm in which Francis placed his greatest faith, and with which he intended to deliver the decisive blow, was advancing toward the imperial line, and the French guns could not fire without risk of hitting their own men. So Francis silenced them. The artillery had been the one asset that gave the French a clear advantage over the imperial infantry. The Spanish arquebusiers could be suppressed, disrupted, driven to cover by cannon fire. Without the guns, there was nothing to neutralize them. And Pescara, who was watching the French deployment with the experienced eye of a man who had been studying Spanish infantry tactics for 30 years, understood immediately what the cessation of French artillery fire meant. He moved his arquebusiers forward. What followed was the central act of the battle and the act that made it historic. Francis led the gendarmerie in a charge. He was at the head of it, as he always was, on a great horse in full armor, his standard visible to everyone on the field, the embodiment of the knightly ideal that the French monarchy had been cultivating for centuries. The charge was magnificent in the way that doomed things are sometimes magnificent. Perfectly executed, perfectly brave, perfectly wrong. The terrain inside the park worked against the cavalry in ways that Francis had not fully considered. The trees and hedges and ornamental features that made the Mirabello beautiful in peacetime broke up the formation of the charging horses, creating gaps and obstacles that slowed the momentum of the charge and prevented the gendarmerie from hitting the imperial line with the concentrated force that made heavy cavalry effective. The horses that had been trained on open ground found themselves navigating obstacles that no amount of training had prepared them for. And through the trees, in the morning mist, came the arquebusiers. The arquebus was a matchlock firearm, ignited by a slow-burning match cord touching a pan of priming powder, which fired the main charge and propelled a lead ball down a smoothbore barrel. It was not a precise weapon. At ranges beyond 50 meters, accuracy was largely a matter of chance. But the arquebusiers were not shooting at individual targets. They were shooting into a mass of horses and men packed together in the broken ground of the park, at ranges close enough that even a smoothbore fired by a shaking hand was likely to hit something. The balls hit armor, and they went through. This was the revelation of Pavia, the thing that the knights who survived the battle carried with them for the rest of their lives. The armor that had protected a man-at-arms from lance thrust and sword stroke and crossbow bolt, the product of centuries of metallurgical refinement, the finest work of the armorer's craft, was penetrated by arquebus fire at combat ranges. Not always, not every ball at every range, but often enough, consistently enough, to change the calculation that every cavalry commander made when he led his men into battle. The horses went down first. Horses were larger targets than men, less well protected, and their loss ended the effectiveness of a knight regardless of what his own armor could or could not stop. The gendarmerie, which had entered the park as the most powerful cavalry force in Europe, was shredded in the smoke and noise of the morning. Its formation broken, its momentum lost, its men fighting and dying and fleeing among the trees of a hunting park that had become an abattoir. Francis fought. Everyone who was there, on both sides, agreed on this. He was everywhere in the melee, refusing to leave the field as the battle collapsed around him, fighting with his own sword when his lance was gone, recognizable to everyone because of his armor and his height and his standard, and the simple fact that he was the king, and the king did not leave. His horse was killed. He was given another. That horse was killed. He fought on foot. Around him, the French army was disintegrating. The Swiss mercenaries, who formed a large part of the French infantry, found themselves engaged with the landsknechts, a confrontation between two groups of professional pikemen whose mutual hatred was legendary, whose combat was hand-to-hand and merciless, and conducted without quarter on either side. The French artillery, silenced at the beginning of the battle and unable to contribute to a fight that had moved too close and too fast for cannon to be useful, stood idle. The imperial cavalry, which had been held back while the arquebusiers did their work, now moved forward to exploit the collapse of the French line. Francis, surrounded and on foot, was taken. The exact circumstances of his capture have been disputed since the day it happened. Multiple imperial soldiers claimed credit. There were lawsuits and counterclaims and appeals to the emperor himself. But the fact was unambiguous. The King of France, the Night King of Marignano, the embodiment of chivalric virtue, was a prisoner. He was surrounded by Spanish soldiers in the mud of the Mirabello Park, and he handed his sword to Charles de Lannoy, the imperial commander, and the battle was over. The losses on the French side were catastrophic. The gendarmerie was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The flower of French nobility, the men who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of battle, were dead or captured in numbers that contemporary accounts describe with a kind of stunned disbelief. The senior commanders who survived were mostly prisoners. Francis himself was alive and uninjured, which was something, but he was in imperial custody, and no one on either side had any clear idea what happened next. What happened next, in the immediate term, was that Francis was transported to Spain with all the ceremony appropriate to a royal prisoner. Charles V, as noted, was careful in his public response. He understood that the capture of a king was not simply a military victory. It was a political crisis of the first order, for the captive, obviously, but also for the captor, who now had to decide what to do with an asset of extraordinary value and extraordinary volatility. The negotiations that followed were long, complicated, and ultimately futile. Francis, held in comfortable but secure captivity, negotiated the Treaty of Madrid in January 1526, agreeing to cede Burgundy to Charles, to renounce his claims in Italy, and to marry Charles's sister Eleanor. He signed, he was released. He crossed the border into France, and within weeks he had repudiated the entire treaty, arguing that agreements made under duress had no legal force. Charles was furious, but he was also, in this as in most things, realistic. There was no mechanism by which he could enforce the treaty. He could not rearrest Francis. He could not invade France immediately. His armies were elsewhere. His finances were strained, and the political situation in Europe was too complex for a straightforward military response. He accepted the repudiation, continued the war, and drew what lessons he could from the experience. Francis, for his part, drew very different lessons from Pavia than the ones a less proud man might have learned. He did not fundamentally reconsider his approach to warfare or his reliance on the gendarmerie. He did not invest heavily in firearms and infantry at the expense of cavalry. He rebuilt the gendarmerie, continued to lead it in person, and remained, until his death in 1547, the Night King. The man who fought from the front, whose identity was inseparable from the chivalric ideal that Pavia had so publicly humiliated. He also became, in the years after Pavia, one of the greatest patrons of the arts that Europe had ever produced, as if the defeat had opened something in him, as if the recognition, however unconscious, that the world he had been trained for was ending, had pushed him toward the creation of beauty as an alternative to the conquest of territory. He brought Leonardo da Vinci to France, where the old master spent his last years at the Château du Clos Lucé. He commissioned the Château de Fontainebleau, and imported Italian artists and craftsmen to decorate it. He built the Château de Chambord in the Loire Valley, one of the most extraordinary buildings of the Renaissance, its roofline a fantasy of towers and chimneys and dormers that has never been satisfactorily explained and never needs to be. He created the Lecteurs Royaux, the forerunners of the Collège de France, to promote humanist learning in competition with the conservative theology of the Sorbonne. Francis, the King of Italy, was finished after Pavia. Francis, the patron of the Renaissance, had only just begun. The tapestries that Van Orley designed to commemorate the battle were almost certainly commissioned as a diplomatic gift. Luxury objects of the highest quality, produced in the workshops of Brussels that were the finest in Europe, intended to be presented to Charles V or to a member of his court as a tangible representation of the imperial victory. They show the battle with a topographic accuracy that suggests Van Orley either visited the site or had access to detailed maps and eyewitness accounts. The Park of Pavia is recognizable. The phases of the fighting are shown in sequence. The commanders are identified by their coats of arms. But what the tapestries cannot quite capture, what no image of Pavia has ever fully captured, is the sound. The sound of the arquebuses firing in the morning mist. Not the thunder of artillery, which was familiar, which had its own terrible grandeur, which at least spoke the same language of overwhelming force that the knight had always understood. The arquebus was different. It was small. It was cheap. It was operated by men who were not aristocrats, who had not devoted their lives to martial training, who wore no armor and carried no heraldic device. It made a noise like a crack of wood rather than a roll of thunder, and it killed knights. The sound that the gendarmerie heard in the mist of February 24th, 1525, was the sound of the future. It was the sound of a world in which military effectiveness was no longer the exclusive property of those who could afford the equipment and the training that had defined the warrior class for 1,000 years. It was the sound of a world in which a 16-year-old with 3 weeks of practice could put a ball through the armor of a man who had trained since childhood for exactly the kind of battle they were now fighting. The aristocracy of Europe spent the next 2 centuries trying to adapt to this reality, with varying degrees of success. The cavalry did not disappear. It remained important in European warfare well into the 19th century, in roles that suited its speed and shock power. But it never again claimed to be the arm that decided battles, the reason the social order was arranged as it was, the justification for the privileges and obligations of the military class. That claim had been answered at Pavia, in the smoke and noise of a few hundred arquebuses fired into a charge of the finest cavalry in the world. The answer was no. The Park of Pavia is still there, much reduced from its 16th century extent, on the outskirts of a medium-sized Italian city that most tourists pass through without stopping on their way to Milan or Genoa. The city itself still stands, its medieval towers visible from the main road, the Ticino still flowing past its walls on its way to join the Po a few kilometers to the south. There is a small monument to the battle in the park, a few information boards, the occasional history enthusiast with a map. The tapestries are in Naples, in the Capodimonte. 7 panels of extraordinary richness and detail. The horses and knights and arquebusiers and the February morning, woven in wool and silk by Flemish craftsmen working from Van Orley's designs, preserved for 5 centuries through the collections of the Farnese and the Bourbons, and finally the Italian state, which keeps them in a climate-controlled gallery where the light is dim and the colors still glow as they were intended to glow when they were new. Go and look at them. Look at the moment when the king went down. Look at the arquebusiers in the trees. Look at Francis on foot in the mud, his horse dead beneath him, the standard that had flown over Marignano now still. Listen for the sound that ended an age. It was smaller than you think. It was quieter than the cannon and louder than a crossbow, and it echoed through the park of Pavia on a February morning, and it has been echoing ever since.